Hello, I'm Chris Lipe. I'm in EIU 4123 Social Movements. My speech documentary or video documentary is on the Freedom Riders part, so here it goes. First off, I like that Freedom Riders starts about 7 minutes in or so, that Irene Morgan, I didn't know this, Irene Morgan refused to give up her seat in 1944. Almost a little more than 10 years before Rosa Parks refused in 1955. Irene Morgan's case went all the way to the Supreme Court to argue her case, and they won with the court's ruling that segregation on the bus was unconstitutional. There was definitely a movement starting to grow even in the 40s and 50s before this Freedom Rider movement took off. In May 1961, where the Freedom Riders start off, there was a group of African American and white civil rights activists that were going to set off on bus trips around the southern states to protest segregation in the bus terminals, and they wanted equality. This was inspired by the above-mentioned Irene Morgan case incident. This happened almost 20 years prior to this 1961 Freedom Riders. Another part of the reason Freedom Rider was to try to make it to New Orleans in connection with the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling. That was their anniversary, and they were wanting to be there to help commemorate that. The group set off from Washington, D.C. and had little problems reported through Virginia and North Carolina. In South Carolina, they started to get some resistance to the Freedom Riders. Some of the members were attacked while trying to enter a whites-only waiting area of a bus station. The group continued on and made it to Atlanta, where some of the riders decided to take a different bus, and this bus was on the Trailways lines. The original was on Greyhound, they continued on the Greyhound. The other group kind of split off, they went on Trailways. I might add here, this is indicative of consciousness-raising ideals we read about in Goodwin and Jasper. Being that there are some students, later on more students of course, but the students and commitments that were required of these individuals were of the thinking that they realized a problem would not be solved through the normal political process, and that they had to get creative, so to speak, and make their own positions known. The bus riders continued and made it on to Anniston, Alabama, while the Greyhound bus was first to make it to Anniston, and the Trailways bus continued on to Alabama. However, the Greyhound bus didn't actually get to stop at the Anniston station, since when the driver was pulling up to the station, they noticed 200 or so white people assembled and trying to surround the bus. Through the crowds, this would be an acting crowd we learned about previously, as the mob was intense and emotional and ready to commit violence. The bus driver was unable to maneuver and make it around, and tried to continue along the way. A tire must have been punctured or something, because he wound up getting a flat, and the mob continued after them in their pursuit, as the mob was thirsty for action and for blood. The tire ended up blowing, and the mob closed in on the bus. One of the mob persons used a crowbar and broke out a rear window of the bus, and appeared another one threw in a explosive type of some sort, and the bus ultimately caught fire, and they had to pull over. There's smoke everywhere. The bus was burning. And the people were, of course, torn between getting off the bus and being beaten, but obviously they didn't want to stay on the bus with the fire, so of course they came off. They were all coughing, and of course the smoke inhalation. There was one little girl reported that she could not stand seeing all these people there getting off the bus and being choking and such, so she would bring people water and bring rags, wet rags, trying to wipe their face, make sure everyone was okay. Then one person was okay, she went up to the next. This little white girl, mind you, was trying to help out these Freedom Riders. Excuse me. The beating of the bus people continued until a state patrolman showed up and fired his weapon in the air. He was quoted as saying, "You've had your fun, now that's enough." The Trailways bus also received some trouble coming into Birmingham, though not to the extent of the Greyhound passengers as far as blowing up or catching fire. There were, however, still angry mob of white people that were beaten of the Freedom Riders getting off the bus. This is part of a protest crowd, as we read about in Jasper and Goodwin, or excuse me, in our initial readings assigned to us. This is part of a protest crowd and or riots, as they were protesting the desegregation of the bus terminals. Safety Commissioner of Birmingham, Bull Connor, said he knew of the arrival, but did nothing to help protect the Freedom Riders. John Patterson, the governor of Alabama, went as far as calling the Freedom Riders agitators. He did this many times throughout the video. They may have just been playing the same clip over, but in any case, they kept making sure that we knew they were called agitators. He said that if they would leave stuff alone, basically well enough alone, and just go back home, no one would be getting hurt. They could just mind their own business. The bus drivers ultimately were fed up with all this violence, and they decided not to drive anymore because they didn't want to put their lives on the line for a cause they didn't necessarily support. The riders were about to quit, beaten and almost just ready to quit and give up, but Diane Nash from Nashville, Tennessee, organized another group of riders to help continue the movement. Governor Patterson agreed to give them protection finally, and they were off on the road from Birmingham. The police protection did not last long, however, as when they started to pull into Montgomery, the police pulled back, and the riders thought, well, the Montgomery law enforcement persons will take over from here. This was not the case. As the riders approached the bus station in Montgomery, they noticed a mob of angry people. There had to be, I think it was read in the paper, in the article it said, on the video there, it said about 300 people attacked 21 from the bus. These 300 even attacked many of the camera crews and people and made them stay away. Let's see. Sorry. This worked for a little while, but when a White House spokesperson was injured in the riots, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy sent in 400 U.S. Marshals. So that helped out and kept the peace for a little while. Martin Luther King ended up having a service at the church there in Montgomery, which attracted, to many surprise, 1,500 some supporters. Another riot ended up breaking out, and Governor Patterson of Alabama could sit by no longer, and he had to make a decision. So martial law was declared in the city, and National Guardsmen were dispatched. It seemed to be okay, and the riders would have protection from there on out, but when they arrived in Mississippi, the Governor Ross Barnett said he knew the riders were coming, and they would be expected to follow laws as is expected of everyone else in the state. Now, he was talking about the segregation, of course, and he basically it didn't matter if it was unconstitutional. This is how the southern states did it, and they were going to get people arrested on trespassing, I believe it was. The riders were, of course, arrested on trespassing charges, and they were sent to prison. This further aggravated the situation, and the riders' movement grew, and more riders came and just let themselves get arrested. They were making a statement and taking a stand. The NAACP fought the convictions all the way to the Supreme Court, which reversed the convictions. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy finally had enough and saw this movement was not going away. So he contacted the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they decided to issue regulations prohibiting the segregation of the interstate bus terminals. A huge win for the civil rights movement. This type of movement is referred to as reform movement that we read about in week 2. In regards to the riders almost quitting, we see this attitude in chapter 10 of Goodwin and Jasper. Collective decision making, in that while they still wanted to support the cause, they were bound by the group decision for the safety to call it off. But as we know, the riders continued, and the rest is history.